Every human being on Earth for roughly 294,000 of the 300,000 years that our species has existed had brown eyes, dark brown, without exception, without variation. Every person who lived, every person who loved, every person who watched the sun rise over the African savanna or the European glacier or the Asian steppe or the Australian coast, every person who looked into the eyes of their children and saw themselves reflected back, brown, all of them, for 250,000 years, the longest unbroken physical characteristic in the history of our species. And then, approximately 6,000 years ago, in one person, in one place, in one single generation, something happened, a mutation, a specific genetic change on chromosome 15 in a gene called OCA2, adjacent to a gene called HERC2. A change so precise, so targeted, so surgically specific that geneticists who study it use language that sounds less like biology and more like engineering. The mutation didn't create a new pigment. It didn't add something to the eye. It reduced something. It dialed down the production of melanin in the iris to a specific degree, not enough to eliminate pigment entirely, not enough to produce albinism, but exactly enough to shift the way light interacts with the stroma of the iris, the tissue layer that gives the eye its visible color. The reduction was calibrated, precise, just enough to make the iris scatter short wavelength light the same way the atmosphere scatters sunlight. The same physics that makes the sky blue made the first blue eye blue. One person. One mutation. Approximately 6,000 years ago. Somewhere near the northwestern coast of the Black Sea, in the region that is now Romania, Bulgaria, or Ukraine. And every blue-eyed person alive today, every single one, all 500 million of them, descends from that one individual. I need you to hold the strangeness of that, not the genetics, which are well documented, the implications, because the implications are what the scientific literature presents as settled and what the deeper investigation reveals as anything but. This raises a simple but critical question. How does a mutation that serves no obvious survival advantage spread from one individual to 500 million in 6,000 years? The official explanation is sexual selection, the same explanation offered for blonde hair. The blue eye was novel. Novelty was attractive. Attraction led to reproduction. Reproduction spread the gene. Over 6,000 years, the mutation expanded from a single individual to a significant percentage of the global population, concentrated primarily in populations of European descent. And sexual selection is a real mechanism. It's documented across species. It explains the peacock's tail and the bowerbird's bower and any number of traits that persist not because they help the organism survive, but because they help the organism reproduce. The blue eye, according to this model, was the human equivalent of a peacock's tail, a display feature, an attractor, something that caught the eye, if you'll forgive the expression, and that was preferentially selected as a mating trait across hundreds of generations. But the deeper I went into the genetics, the more the sexual selection explanation started to strain, because the spread of blue eyes wasn't gradual and uniform, the way sexual selection typically distributes a trait through a population. It was rapid and concentrated. The mutation appeared approximately 6,000 years ago. Within 3,000 years, it was present at high frequency across a vast geographic range spanning from Scandinavia to the Mediterranean, from Ireland to Central Asia. The speed of the spread exceeds what population geneticists would predict from sexual selection alone, especially in a pre-modern population with limited mobility and small community sizes. Something else was driving the spread, something beyond attractiveness, something that gave the blue-eyed individual, or the community that carried the blue-eye gene, a selective advantage that the sexual selection model doesn't fully capture. The silence was deafening when I started looking for what that advantage might have been, as if they were following instructions they didn't fully understand. Here's where the investigation splits into two threads that eventually converge. The first thread is biological. The second is historical. And where they meet is a place that the official narrative has no framework for acknowledging. The biological thread. Blue eyes are not just a color variation. The reduction in melanin that produces blue irises also produces a measurable difference in how the eye processes light. Blue-eyed individuals have less pigment in the iris, which means more light passes through the iris and reaches the retina. In high-light environments, this is a disadvantage. More light means more glare, more UV exposure, more potential for retinal damage. But in low-light environments, the advantage inverts. More light reaching the retina means better visual performance in dim conditions. Blue-eyed individuals can, measurably, see better in low light than brown-eyed individuals. Pull up the research yourself. Studies on iris pigmentation and scotopic vision in low-light conditions, have documented a small but statistically significant advantage for lighter-eyed individuals in dim environments. The difference isn't dramatic. It's not the difference between seeing and not seeing. But in an environment where low-light visual performance was a survival variable, where the ability to see a predator at dusk or navigate terrain in twilight or hunt in the dim forests of post-Ice Age Northern Europe could mean the difference between life and death, even a small visual advantage would be selectively amplified across generations. And the mutation appeared at approximately the right time and the right place for this advantage to matter. 6,000 years ago, the Black Sea region, the edge of the expanding agricultural frontier in Europe, a population that was moving northward into increasingly forested, increasingly overcast, increasingly low-light environments where the long winters and the dense canopy reduced the available light for significant portions of the year. An environment where seeing better in dim conditions wasn't just useful, it was survival. But the biological thread alone doesn't explain the speed of the spread. A small visual advantage in low light would produce gradual selection pressure over many thousands of years. The blue-eye gene spread faster than gradual. It spread as if it were being carried by a population that was itself expanding, a population that was moving, replacing, dominating. And here's where the second thread, the historical thread, connects. The deeper I went into the ancient DNA evidence, the more I found that the spread of blue eyes across Europe maps almost perfectly onto the spread of a specific population, the same population I encountered in the investigation of blonde hair, the steppe pastoralists, the Yamnaya and their descendants, the mobile, horse-riding, wagon-driving people who moved out of the Pontic steppe north of the Black Sea beginning roughly 5,000 years ago and whose migration transformed the genetic landscape of Europe within a few centuries. The ancient DNA evidence is now extensive, hundreds of samples from archaeological sites across Europe, spanning the period from roughly 8,000 years ago to 3,000 years ago, have been sequenced, and the picture they paint is remarkable. Before the steppe migration, European populations had overwhelmingly dark eyes. The hunter-gatherers who inhabited Europe for millennia after the Ice Age had a high frequency of blue eyes in some regions, particularly in northern Europe. But the Neolithic farming populations that had spread across Europe from Anatolia starting roughly 9,000 years ago were predominantly brown-eyed. The genetic variants associated with blue eyes were present at low frequency. Then the steppe populations arrived, and blue-eye frequency exploded. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision across every region the steppe populations entered. The incoming steppe ancestry carried the blue-eye variant at high frequency. As the steppe populations mixed with and in many regions largely replaced the existing European populations, the blue eye frequency in the combined population surged. The spread of blue eyes across Europe wasn't primarily driven by sexual selection. It was driven by population replacement. The blue-eyed people didn't out-attract the brown-eyed people. They outpopulated them. And the population replacement, as I documented in the investigation of blonde hair, was not peaceful. The archaeological record of the period shows widespread evidence of demographic disruption, settlement abandonment, population decline among pre-existing groups, the arrival of new burial customs, new material culture, new social structures that replaced the old ones within generations. The blue eye didn't spread through a stable population because it was pretty. It spread through a population that was being transformed by the arrival of a new dominant group that carried the trait at high frequency. Here's where the story becomes something that the official narrative cannot accommodate. Because the coincidence of timing, the precision of the mutation, and the specificity of its effects are difficult to explain within the standard framework of random mutation and natural selection. The OCA2 mutation that produces blue eyes is not a simple on-off switch. It's a regulatory change. It affects how much melanin is produced in the iris, not whether melanin is produced at all. The change is precisely calibrated. A little more reduction, and the eye would be functionally impaired, too sensitive to light, too prone to damage. A little less reduction, and the visual benefit in low-light conditions would vanish. The mutation sits at a precise point on a spectrum of possible changes, producing exactly enough pigment reduction to alter light processing without compromising eye health. The precision is what makes geneticists describe it in engineering language, because the margin of functional benefit is narrow, and the mutation landed exactly within it. Random mutation is supposed to be random, undirected, unguided. The standard evolutionary framework insists that mutations occur without purpose and that selection, acting after the fact, determines which mutations persist. And within that framework, the blue eye mutation is a lucky accident. A random change that happened to land in the narrow functional window, and that happened to appear in a population that happened to be expanding into an environment where it happened to provide an advantage. The deeper I went, the more the pile of coincidences grew uncomfortable. A mutation of unusual precision, appearing in a population of unusual mobility, at a moment of unusual environmental transition, spreading at an unusual speed, carried by a population whose expansion produced unusual demographic transformation across an entire continent. Each element, individually, can be explained within the standard framework. Together, they form a pattern that the standard framework struggles to accommodate without invoking an improbable chain of coincidences. And the ancient cultures that carried the trait treated it as something other than coincidence. Go look at the mythological traditions of the populations that descended from the steppe migrations, the Indo-European peoples, the cultures that became the Greeks, the Romans, the Celts, the Germans, the Slavs, the Indo-Iranians. Their mythological traditions are saturated with references to eyes, to the power of the gaze, to the significance of eye color as a marker of divine or heroic status. Athena is described as glaucopis, a Greek word traditionally translated as bright-eyed or gray-eyed, but whose exact color reference has been debated for centuries. Odin sacrifices one eye to gain wisdom, a myth that specifically locates cosmic knowledge in the organ of sight. The Celtic traditions describe the evil eye, the eye of power, the gaze that could kill or heal depending on who wielded it. These mythological traditions don't just reference eyes generically, they reference eye color specifically. Light eyes are associated with the gods, with heroes, with supernatural sight, with the ability to see things that dark-eyed mortals cannot. The mythology encodes, in the language of story and symbol, a cultural memory that light eyes were significant, that they marked their bearers as different, that the difference was connected to perception, to knowledge, to a way of seeing the world that was not available to everyone. I'm not telling you blue eyes are supernatural. I'm not telling you the steppe populations were divinely favored. I'm telling you that a mutation of unusual precision appeared in a specific population at a specific moment, spread at a speed that population genetics struggles to explain through sexual selection alone, was carried across a continent by a population whose expansion transformed the genetic landscape of Europe, and was encoded in the mythological traditions of every culture that descended from that expansion as a marker of extraordinary sight and divine connection. I'm asking what the mutation actually was, not what it did to melanin, what it did to perception, what the low-light visual advantage actually meant for a population that used it, whether the advantage was limited to scotopic vision or whether the change in how light interacted with the iris produced perceptual differences that modern ophthalmology hasn't measured because it hasn't thought to look. I'm asking why every ancient culture that carried the blue-eye gene mythologized it as something beyond ordinary sight. Whether the myths encode an experiential reality that the bearers of the trait recognized and that modern science has dismissed as superstition without investigating. Whether the blue eye sees something that the brown eye doesn't, not metaphorically, not mystically, but optically, neurologically, in the measurable processing of light by a differently structured iris. I'm asking what happened 6,000 years ago on the shores of the Black Sea that produced a trait so precise it looks engineered, so successful it spread to 500 million people, so significant that every culture that carried it built myths around it, and so poorly understood that the best explanation modern science can offer is that it was attractive. I'm asking what blue eyes actually see, handed an eye color and told it was cosmetic,